Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our Irish American Heritage Month webinar. I'm Danny O'Connell, National President of the Ancient Order of Hibernians, and today we're going to have a webinar on Michael McGovern, the Puddler poet. Give me just a moment here.
Welcome, men of Irish blood. With open arms we meet you. In the name of Irish nationhood and faith, we hospitably greet you. We welcome you with all the love and friendship men shroud o'er each other, and hope each grasp we give may prove the honest pressure of a brother. For Ireland's triumphs and her woes, for virtues that enhance her glory, for wrongs inflicted by her foes that go to make the blackest story, for love of freedom always hers, which love may yet its crown accord her. Céad Míle Fáilte visitors, true members of her ancient order.
So that, of course, was the words of our AOH member, Michael McGovern, as he was writing to call the Ancient Order of Hibernians to convention in Youngstown, Ohio, the Ohio State Convention. Joining me today is our National Irish American Heritage Month Chairman, Neil Cosgrove, our National Historian, Daniel Taylor, our IT gurus, Chris Cook, North Carolina State President, Tim Noonan from Chicago, and our guests from Ireland, Eileen Finnegan, who's the IT person in the background, keeping Leo and his Jim straight, Leo Finnegan, and Jim Fahy. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to our National Chair, Dan Taylor.
Thank you, Danny. And today, I should note, is the second of our Saturday presentations in this Irish Heritage Month series. Last week on Saturday, we had a wonderful presentation by Professor Rune O'Donnell about the role of Irish America in the rising of 1916 and the important years thereafter up through the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. That presentation, by the way, can be viewed on the AOH YouTube channel at the leisure of anyone who missed us last week. But what we heard last week was the story of mass immigration that followed the Great Hunger on Gorta Moor. And we heard about the creation of large organizations by which Irish America wielded influence here in America and abroad. And we heard about the cross-Atlantic nature of the movement that led to the Easter Rising and the proclamation of an Irish Republic. The subject of our presentation today, Michael McGovern, is a marvelous example of the cross-Atlantic nature of that movement to establish an Irish Republic that we discussed last week. A member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, McGovern found it necessary to remove himself from British jurisdiction and found his way to the United States. Once here, like many Irish immigrants, he found work in the heavy industries that literally made modern America. McGovern was a puddler, and we will hear that puddling was a process by which the relatively brittle pig iron was made more malleable and usable in a puddling furnace. Puddlers were strong, skilled men who did dirty, dangerous work, and McGovern, we will hear today, was rightly proud of the work that he did. Now, McGovern was very much like his fellow Irish immigrants in that he became involved in the labor movement. James Connolly famously declared that the cause of labor is the cause of Ireland, and the cause of Ireland is the cause of labor. John Devoy, the longtime leader of Clan na Gael here in America, is known to have stated that there would have been no Easter Rising without financial contributions from the US labor movement. And when the striking steelworkers at Homestead, near where I'm coming to you from today, found themselves under attack by heavily armed Pinkertons in 1892, which was the subject of a McGovern poem we will hear about later, some of the weapons that those workers were able to arm themselves with came from the local company of the Hibernian Rifles. While the story of McGovern is very much typical of Irish immigrants of the day, McGovern distinguished himself by supporting the cause of Irish liberty and the cause of labor with his poetry. And today our program details the remarkable story of the Puddler poet. And to tell that story, we are fortunate to have with us two men who have made a study of McGovern's life and who are working to make his story more widely known. Leo Finnegan, like Michael McGovern, was born in Williamstown, County Galway, and apart from time away pursuing his education, has lived most of his life in his native parish. Leo's working life was spent as a primary teacher, and he and his wife, Eileen, also a Williamstown native and retired educator, raised 3 children there at Williamstown and are now the proud grandparents of 6. Leo has been involved with the Williamstown Heritage Society since the year 2000 and is currently its chairman. The society is an outstanding example of a local history organization and has completed numerous high-profile projects by which the story of the Williamstown area has been documented and preserved. You can find more information at their webpage, williamstownheritage.com. For the past 4 years, Leo and Eileen have been researching the life and times of Michael McGovern, together with our second presenter today, Jim Fahy. Jim is a well-known Irish journalist and documentary maker. Unable to pursue his childhood goal of being an airline pilot, Jim embarked on an award-winning career in journalism. After almost a decade working in print journalism, Jim joined RTE in 1974 as its first Western news correspondent. In the course of a long career, Jim made over 450 editions of the popular Looking West program about storytellers and musicians in the west of Ireland. When Jim retired from RTE in 2011, Irish President Michael D. Higgins was widely quoted as saying that every single thing that happened in the west of Ireland, be it political or cultural or international, the first thing people would say to each other was, "Have you contacted Jim Fahy?" Like Leo, Jim is a native of County Galway, hailing from the village of Kilrickle. And so today we are pleased to have these 2 distinguished Galway men with us to discuss the fascinating life of Michael McGovern, the Puddler poet. Leo and Jim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for that warm welcome. And at the outset, I'd just like to say that Jim and I are delighted and honored to be given this opportunity to make a presentation on the life of Michael McGovern, who by any standards is a remarkable man, a multi-talented individual who made such a great contribution in many fields of life and who is still remembered today in many sections of the United States, and who came within a hair's breadth of being forgotten forever in his own country and in his own parish. And this would have happened were it not for a series of coincidences. That would have been a tragedy because he is one man that definitely deserves to be remembered. If I could set the background briefly to this story of McGovern, my colleagues and I in the Williamstown Heritage Society have delivered a number of projects in the last 20 years. Now, 2 of them are very relevant to the story today, so I'll just mention them briefly. In 2013, we produced a major book in which we researched every single house and every single family in our parish, tracing the generations back as far as we could go. When we came to search for McGovern, this proved to be invaluable. A second project, which ties in again to today's story, we put up a plaque in honour of another local poet, not so well known, Tommy Scally in Cairnderry. We erected the plaque close to his home. Now, as it happens, Jim, my co-presenter today, was trying out one of our local walks. He passed this plaque and he said to himself, "I know that man. I think I recall interviewing him many years ago on Looking West." So Jim went back to his home, he took out the tape, listened to it again, and heard the following statement from Tommy. He was asking Tommy about the local hedge schools in the locality, and Tommy said the best known was one in Buchla, and there was one scholar there who went on to great things in the United States as a poet. His name was Michael McGovern. He was from the farm area of Williamstown. On leaving down the tape, Jim contacted us and said, "Have you heard of Michael McGovern?" We said we hadn't, but we certainly would try and find out. So what do? We consulted the book, which I've just referred to, our 2013 book. Now, farm, if you like, is a collection of 6 or 7 townlands in our parish. So one by one, we examined them all. And of course, we left Castlefield until last. When we got Castlefield, there was John Govern. It was our second eureka moment. The first one was Jim spotting the plaque, and the second one was this. So this was the start of our fabulous journey, which is still ongoing today. And Jim has led us in this endeavor. He has led the research, and I cannot speak too highly of all the work that he has done. Eileen, my wife, has done a huge amount of research also, and the net result of all of this is that we have a clear picture of the unique life of the man that we know as Michael McGovern, the Puddler poet. Now, Daniel has explained to you what the term Puddler means. Someone who works in a rolling mill, taking the impurities from the molten pig iron and changing it into steel. Difficult job, a back-breaking job, a very unhealthy job. Now, McGovern's life, if you like, breaks neatly into 3 distinct stages, because he spent the first 19 years of his life in Castlefield, in our own parish, the next 15 in the Sheffield area of Yorkshire in England, and the final 51 years of his life in the United States. Now, that last one, if you like, can be subdivided into 2, because the first 10 of those were in the Lehigh Valley area of Pennsylvania, and the final 41 were in his adopted town of Williamstown. Now, for each of those 3 locations and those 3 countries, we went through the usual resource methods, and we found much information in areas like church records, state records, census records, archives, libraries, the lot, and we came up with much information for all 3 locations. But we all know that nothing can compare with having the material on the ground, having the personnel on the ground, and in each case we were lucky in this regard as well. As regards the Ireland section of the story, Michael McGovern was born about 3 miles from where I'm sitting now, in the townland of Castlefield in Williamstown Parish, in the year of Black 1847, the worst year of the Great Famine. The potato crop had failed for the 3rd year in a row that people were in dire straits. Castlefield took a particular hammering because prior to the famine, there were 39 families there. A few years after the famine, this had reduced to 9. Difficult times, but the McGovern family thrived. Govern was the original name, the Mac was added later. Michael was the youngest of 4 children of John Govern and Bridget Flynn. He had 2 sisters, Sabina and Catherine, and 1 brother, James. Michael was the youngest. Michael was particularly bright. Now, life was not easy for the young McGovern. The parents were ambitious. There was no official school in the locality, shall we say now, in theory. The penal laws had been abolished with O'Connell in 1828, but it still hadn't filtered down to the rural areas. Now, there were hedge schools, and as our friend Tommy Scally mentioned earlier, there was a thriving one in Buchla, a couple of miles from McGovern's home. Now, Michael attended that for a brief period of 3 months, and that was the only formal education he ever got. But he was highly intelligent. Now, in addition to making our information through the various sources that I mentioned to you, it brings the whole thing to life for us when we think that we know the house where McGovern was born, and it's still standing today. We know the fields where he worked and played. We know little byroads where he walked. We know where he went to church. We know where he went to school. And we also know some of his people, because the Flynn family from Castlefield are related to McGovern. The Connemara family from Cloneygrassan and Ballintubber are related to McGovern even closer, because in fact, the grandmother of the Connemars, Ellen Grady Connemara, is actually a niece of the Puddler himself, and that's how close it is. And you know, the Connemara family have 3 lovely memories, because one copy of McGovern's book, he only published 1 book, Labour Lyrics and Other Poems. It did make its way to Ballintubber, and they do remember that. Now, like all books, it tends to go missing, and it was a problem to find it, but they do remember the book being there. Another memory that they have is that their father would often refer to McGovern, the poet. And the third memory that they have, on passing the head of Castlefield Road, the father would always say, in there was where the poet McGovern was born. So as Michael was growing up as a teenager, his father got him apprenticed to a local shoemaker, Dominic Finnegan. McGovern was not happy in this task. He decided it was not for him. He didn't turn up. Finnegan was not impressed. He took the young McGovern to court. McGovern did not attend the court. What did he do? He skipped to England, so he come to the second stage of his life. But before we leave the first stage, I'd like to read to you one of McGovern's poems. It's called The Vision of Young Contentment. Now, it wasn't written when he was in Ireland, but it's formulated in Ireland. He's going back to the thoughts of his young years. And in fact, despite the difficulties of the time, he was quite content. While young contentment sleeping lay and dreamed the dreams of childhood, his youthful fancies roamed away through future's distant wildwood, where far beyond the dreamy haze he saw with keen precision ambition's heights in glory blaze which beautified the vision. And up the narrow paths that led toward the phantom mountains, where down from gold or diamond bed flowed nectared rills and fountains. He always paused if wisdom's eyes in vain pursuits had found him, till reason with its counsel wise diffused its spells around him. And though he saw some proudly win, he harboured no resentment. He found sufficient fame within the valley of contentment. Considering the period in which he lived, it's nice to see that he was relatively content. He went to England in 1866. He didn't go for the major Irish centres like Liverpool, Manchester, London. He went to Sheffield. We are not exactly sure why, but Sheffield was a notable place at that time for many reasons, three in particular. It was the centre of the steel industry, not just in England, but in the whole world. It was where unions were beginning to blossom for the first time. And relevant to McGovern, it was where the Republican Irish movement was thriving. The IRB was very active there. Now, let's not forget, this is a fledgling organization. It was only formed in 1858, 8 years before this. McGovern immediately got involved because in 1867, there was a failed attack on Chester Castle. McGovern joined the IRB immediately after that, became very active, became a centre in one of the branches, became a secretary in one of their branches. Now, in addition to finding out the usual information through the regular sources, we were lucky enough to find a page, a handwritten page that McGovern wrote much later in his life in connection with John Devoy, the famous editor of the Gaelic American and the leader of the organization. Now, in it, he told us much about his time in England. He told us that he acted as a centre, that he acted as a secretary, and he told us that towards the end of his time in England, the police were getting suspicious. So, in fact, he had to leave quietly. Now, before that, he met Anne Murphy, and Anne, as you would guess from her name, had Irish parents. She was English born. They married in 1972, and by the end of the 1970s, they had 4 children. Now, when the time came that Michael was under suspicion from the police, his friends in the IRB spirited him first to Liverpool and then smuggled him across the ocean to America. He had to leave Anne behind, he had to leave his 4 children behind, and he made his way. We think he landed in Philadelphia. That was, if you like, the end of the England part of his career. And again, maybe a little poem to go with this, because much of his poetry was nature poetry, and this one is one of those old country robin, and the thoughts in it still link him to Ireland. Winter songster perched upon that leafless alder tree, is it of grief in twittering's brief you fain would sing to me, or think'st of our bright days gone? A robin, dost thine heart feel gay when other birds are sad? That winter snow which bringeth woe to many make thee glad, to which thou sing'st such mellow lay. I say of thee, red-breasted bird, while listening to thy song, a fairy tune, a banshee's croon, once heard, remember long, is thine when thou to song art stirred. So you can see the Irish recollections are still very strong there. Now, this was a difficult situation for Michael, a difficult situation for Anne and the children. Michael made his way to the Lehigh Valley in Philadelphia. Now, there were lots of steelwork there, so he had no difficulty in getting work. We think it's around this time that he started writing poetry. Anne and the children joined him in 1982. They moved around Allentown, Ferndale, different cities, towns in that locality. It was then that he started writing poetry. He became very well known. He was even known as the Ferndale poet. He also became actively involved with his union, the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers. In 1986, there was a big collection of steel workers gathering in Beaver Falls. He was one of the main attractions because he was well known as a poet then. Then in 1891, they made their final move, if you like. They went to Youngstown and they spent the rest of their life there until he died in 1933 at the age of 85. Now, during those 41 years in Youngstown, there are so many highlights that I could only briefly touch on them. But later on, Jim and I will put some flesh and some substance on the bones. Just to pick out a few of them now, we'll say 1891, he arrived there. Now, we'll say he published his only book in 1899, Labour, Lyrics and Other Poems. It was a huge success. A massive amount of copies are printed. And in the meantime, they had moved to different parts of Youngstown, Monkey's Nest, Grey Street, and different places, but always, on the move. Now, he and Anne had a long and happy marriage, but it was tinged with so much sadness because of the 13 children, 9 of them actually died before themselves. Now, it's difficult enough for a parent to lose one child, but to lose 9 is actually unbelievable. So, just the bones there of the 3 stages of McGovern's life. And just before I hand you over to Jim, I'll read you one more of McGovern's poems. This is one of his nicest. He called it the Socialist Church, but it could be called everyone's church. The church in which I always pray was built by God's own hand. Its dome is in the Milky Way, mid stars its pillars stand. The sunshine is its arc of light, the earth is one great pew. And looking down its aisles at night, God's wondrous works I view. The seasons are the artists which God sends to decorate my church with all that's truly rich in nature's passing state, whose pictures are his miracles, ere passing forward the eye, amongst which ourselves are particles that bloom a while and die. So I'll leave it at that for the moment. I've just barely touched on the 3 stages of McGovern's life in Ireland, in England, and now in the United States. We'll put some flesh and substance on that in a little while, but for the moment, I'll hand you over to my colleague, Jim Fahy.
Thank you very much, Leo, and to everybody who's joining us this afternoon. You get a sense there from Leo, who has very deftly taken his historical paintbrush and his canvas and his easel, and he's created for us a landscape from which this solitary figure, Michael McGovern, emerges. And McGovern was, of course, a very significant figure in the labor movement in the United States in that period from the 1870s onwards. But as Dan Taylor was saying earlier on, he was just part of an enormous diaspora of Irish people who were scattered to the 4 corners of the earth by circumstances of history and geography and political upheaval in the 18th and 19th centuries. So he is this figure of millions, of whom perhaps no more than a couple of thousand Irish men and women are remembered today. The lives of most of them are forgotten, but the life of Michael McGovern is actually worth recalling. And he was, I suppose, one of the people of whom Emily Lawless, the fantastically powerful poet, wrote in her poem After Aughrim, in which she says that her sons were cast to the howling seas and to the waves. They were battered and they were bleeding. They were forced to the 4 corners of the earth, and 10 times they were beaten down and 10 times they rose again. And she never knew of what their achievements were. She was the old woman era at home, but from time to time, their names came echoing down the wind to her blown backwards from the lips of fame. And in a sense, that's what we're trying to achieve with this webinar today, and with the work we've been doing in the life of Michael McGovern, is to take him back and to hear his voice being or coming, echoing down the winds, coming backwards from the lips of fame. Because Michael McGovern was, in fact, quite an extraordinary man to have achieved what he did at the time in which he did. Just to give you a sense of McGovern, Leo has sketched out for you where he came from. But let me tell you that Michael McGovern came from a family who had 10 acres of land as tenants of will of a great Catholic landlord, because some of the Irish landlords of the 19th century were actually Catholic as well as Protestants. They had to very deftly move politically through the times that were in it to hold on to their land, but they had 28,000 acres of land. Now, 28,000 acres of land mightn't seem a great deal to somebody in Ohio or Texas or somewhere like that, but in Ireland it was an enormous estate. And Michael McGovern's parents had 10 acres of that from which they could be ejected at the whim of the landlord. They were, in a sense, people, Michael McGovern's people. The name McGovern, by the way, means of or coming from a proud people. They were people who owned nothing. I think this is the baseline that you must begin to see the life of Michael McGovern from. They didn't own the little farm they lived on. They didn't own the little house that they lived in. They didn't own the byre that their cow or horse was kept in. They didn't own the bog where they cut the peat, which would have provided them with fuel and indeed sometimes even light around the fireside. They didn't own the well from which they drew their water. They didn't actually own the water they drank. They were of that generation of Irish people who survived at the will of the landlord through their own strength and force of courage and personality, their perseverance and their determination that the next generation would do better than they would. So you had John and Bridget McGovern trying to raise a small family in those shocking circumstances. I mean, we talk of the third world today, and we talk of how people are homeless and own almost nothing, but this was very close to that kind of existence. And yet from that, McGovern had the get up and go to Sheffield in England to become a puddler, which was a complex, arcane trade, to work away at that, and then to become involved in his secret life with the IRB there. And that's a story that's very, very difficult to unravel. But clearly, he himself has told us that he was in the IRB, that at the same time as he was a centre of a circle, the centre was the man who was the head, or basically he was the captain of a unit of about 800 men. The Fenians were organized in that cell fashion that, revolutionary organizations all around the world subsequently adopted to prevent them being infiltrated. Certainly didn't always work in the case with Irish organizations, because infiltration and betrayal became one of the reasons for the downfall of many revolutionary Irish organizations. But McGovern was a head of a group in Yorkshire at the same time as Michael Davitt was in Lancashire. Davitt was working in the textile mills. McGovern had a much tougher job, really, in the steel mills. And he organized various events. We do not know the extent to which he was involved in the more militant aspects of the IRB, which at the time was mounting a very, very serious bombing campaign across England, all the way from Manchester down to London to Clerkenwell. But whatever he was at, the police started to close in on him sometime in the very late 1870s, and he had to be smuggled, as he says himself, on board a ship from Liverpool to America to begin his new life there. And that mirrors something which we heard about in last week's talk of De Valera being smuggled to the United States in 1919 when he was beginning his great coast-to-coast tour, which actually took him to Youngstown also, where one of the official greeters on the occasion was Michael McGovern. McGovern, on each great occasion of an Irish-American nature or a Union nature in Youngstown, invariably was the greeter and the bard and the poet laureate, really, who wrote the welcoming poems. So the poem for the AOH was one of the most significant of these. But there were other occasions when the Friends of America, the Irish American Association, was founded, and he welcomed them to Youngstown. He also welcomed the Amalgamated Union to Youngstown during one of its conventions, and he welcomed De Valera with a rip-roaring poem, lionizing Eamon De Valera. But so this is the McGovern that we are talking about today, having come from Ireland via England to America. But the enormously significant thing is how he actually became a poet in the adverse situation which he did. As Leo explained, he spent about 3 months or so at a head school. And these were makeshift schools which were held in barns and cabins where old wandering teachers taught their pupils, their barefooted pupils, the rudiments of mathematics and English and Irish, but also introduced them to Greek and Latin, which is quite extraordinary. And you see echoes of that learning that McGovern took initially from around the fireside in Castlefield, and then from this little head school a few miles down the road to England and to America, and which he would drop into his poetry relating to Labour campaigns or Irish political campaigns as easily as he would in using a reference to some event in England, classical events from Greek and Rome philosophers. Became part of the language McGovern used with ease, and he wrote in Irish, Gaelic, he wrote in English, and he was capable of using Latin analogies to hammer home his message. So he probably, because he was a Labour poet, he would not be regarded as a mainstream poet, in the way, in an American sense, that perhaps Frost or someone like that would be. But he was described on numerous occasions as probably the greatest song poet of his time. And there are many descriptions of the impact that his poetry had on working men and on the unions that he put steel and stuffing into when they were going through very difficult times. There is a reference, if I can and find it here, which gives you a sense of how McGovern was regarded by his contemporaries. On his death in 1933, the Vindicator carried a report which said that McGovern's poems were circulated amongst working men until blackened and thumbed into tatters, they were unreadable. But many memorized the poems and could repeat them as readily as the author himself. There were labour troubles in those days, and in all such disputes, the iron masters feared one of his poems more than the occasional violence by strike leaders. McGovern's old friends, who saw hard, hot summer days in the mills with him, have memories of the tremendous influence his poems had when he washed dirty hands at night and set them to white paper. And that's the abiding image I have of Michael McGovern, this tall, steely man. I imagine him from the few photographs that remain and from the descriptions others have given us of him as being a tall, steely, upright man of enormous character. A very handsome man, by the way. He could have come from Central Casting looking at his photographs. And he had these inquisitive, engaging eyes. And he was that big presence who lived a very robust and worked in probably one of the most difficult industries that existed at the time as part of the nation building of the United States through its steel industry. And so this is the McGovern who would get out of bed at, I think, about 6 o'clock in the morning when the charging whistles blew in the mills, take his lunch pail, which is very much part of the American story, really, of the workman taking his tin can of food, which his wife very often had prepared the night before, to the mill to have at lunchtime, wearing hobnail boots, a leather apron, and bringing with them an iron cleaning rag to protect his hand from being burned. And he describes once or twice how sometimes they were stripped to the waist in the mills, when each day they stood in front of these red-hot volcanic furnaces, when a helper would put 600 pounds of pig iron, which was fairly valueless, into this furnace. It was heated to about 1400 degrees centigrade. It was poked with a raveling iron by the puddler until the impurities were driven out of it. And the puddler had to have a more scientific brain to know at the exact point from the heat and from the sound and the color and the oxidization that was taking place that this relatively valueless pig iron had become very valuable steel. And then he took that 600 pounds volcanic ball of molten metal, sliced it into 3 separate 200-pound heats, or the heat roller was the 600-pound ball. He sliced it into 3 balls, rolled it around the place, got it out, and did that 12 hours a day, sometimes stripped to the waist. You just imagine the backbreaking work. And he tells us that while he was doing all of that, the images and the thoughts for his poetry were fashioned during those backbreaking days. And he had a habit of trudging home at night and then going to the kitchen or somewhere, washing his hands, chatting to his family briefly, then taking himself off to his room and sitting down and writing poems that resonated all across industrial America and that had such fire and passion in them that made him known as the Puddler poet. And you know, there are many. You could quote so many poems, and maybe if we have a town hall sense question and answer session later, we can get a sense of what people would like to learn about McGovern, because we could talk on about him between St. Patrick's Day and Christmas Day. But it would be interesting to know what particularly interests people who are joining us today about McGovern's life. But it was, Dan mentioned that fearsome Homestead strike, which took place in 1892, I think, when the Carnegie and Frick, who were the people in charge of the Homestead mill, decided to lock out the strikers and attempted to break a strike. And the strikers barricaded themselves inside the mills and were set upon eventually by Pinkertons, who came down the river in barges with heavily armored barges, preparing to using them as a landing craft to go and retake the mills. But if they did, the Frick's defenders, as the striking union men were called, made it hot and heavy for them, including commandeering a cannon, setting it up, firing on the barges, and eventually, with considerable loss of life, the Pinkertons withdrew, surrendered, and the strikers held on to the rolling mill for a period until the state troopers arrived, 8,000 of them, and drove them out. But McGovern wrote this poem which resonates right down through time, when he said and it was a poem which he wrote and which he spoke or declared or declaimed from a platform in Youngstown during the strike. And that, I think, reading about it last night, was attended by about 6,000 people who were in Youngstown, mill workers, obviously, who were supporting the nearby Homestead strikers. And it's a long poem, but the last lines of it I find particularly powerful, and they have an Irish resonance about them as well. And it says, "Send forth the word on spirit wings, that wealth no longer shall maintain in this free land its petty kings. Their armed thugs and private armies we will defy. With the votes as weapons yielded right, the cause of labour shall not die. And that was the voice of McGovern standing up and being heard as a rallying cry for working men and women in Pennsylvania and Ohio at that time. So, I mean, we could go on forever telling you more about McGovern, because the fact that he is best known and best remembered as a Labour poet is just a tiny fraction of his achievement as a writer and as a poet. He has written some absolutely beautiful lyrical poetry, narrative poetry. He's written a lot of short stories. He was a newspaper columnist for years. He engaged with Williamstown daily, offering opinions, joshing people along in political situations. In fact, he stood briefly for election to the position of basically president of the Chamber of Commerce or deputy mayor of the city, and unfortunately he didn't succeed. He was rejected. He became a rather political figure in the end, in that he joined Teddy Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party and stood under that label, under that banner rather, when he was seeking election in Youngstown. And we're never quite clear whether he was a Democrat or whether he was a Republican, but he espoused the Republican cause and the Republican political philosophy. And he's written enormously about that time. And so that's the Michael McGovern we know of so far. He's the man who, in a sense, has slipped through some of the cracks of history, but from which we are determined to revive him. And we have modest proposals, really, to try to create a biography of him, to have memorials of some kind erected to him, both in his hometown in Williamstown and hopefully in Youngstown, and to engage a new generation of people in his writings, because they do resonate, and in the context of global struggles between workers and capitalism, what he wrote then still has an enormous relevance and resonance. And we would like a new generation to know that there was an Irishman, one of the millions and millions of Irishmen who were scattered to the four corners of the earth by adversity, and who carved out lives for themselves that inspired others, and that can still today be an inspiration to those who struggle for freedom and those who struggle for achievement and empowerment. And as he himself also said, he was particularly interested in education and in literacy. And in the introduction to his Labour lyrics and other poems, he said he wanted to write about Labour, but he also wanted to write about affairs of the heart, of romance and love, and that a labouring man with blackened hands could feel as strongly in his heart the emotions and the affections of love for another human being as somebody who owned a castle or who was a titled person or had a crown sitting on his head, that he wasn't debarred from experiencing the finest and finer emotions of life simply because he had blackened hands and wore heavy boots and worked stripped to the waist at times.
And let us not forget either that there were many aspects from McGovern's life, because we've touched on his family already. And again, that was mixed with sadness and with joy. Losing 9 children was an amazing event. He had his work. Now, after 33 years working as a puddler, he worked in various other occupations after that. He ran a saloon for 5 years. He worked as a fireman. He worked as a council employee. He worked as an oil inspector. Another element of his life was that he was heavily involved in politics all of his life. Now, he never lost touch with the Irish situation, always kept in touch, and always was veering towards the militant side rather than the peaceful side. When the treaty talks were coming up, he was warning the people involved, don't trust the English, because you're not going to get your way from them. So politics was a huge part of his life. And even in America, he took the side of the Americans in 1898 when the Cuban War broke out between Spain and America. He made it clear which side he was on. So politics was a huge part of his life all the time. Now, as regards his talent, we tend to concentrate on his poetry, but there was much more to him than his poetry. Now, Jim has touched on his poetry and how significant was his poetry. We're inclined to think that it was quite good, because one of the academics in Notre Dame, Indiana at the time had these two beautiful things to say. The work of McGovern's is the closest to true art in literature. And he also said that McGovern as a poet is second to none in North America. Now, the message of McGovern was maybe ahead of its time. As Jim has hinted there was an element of protest to it, because we could claim that possibly he was one of the first protest writers, because the same message was carried on much later by, in the 1950s, people like Woody Guthrie, in the 1960s, people like Bob Dylan, in the 1970s, people like Bruce Springsteen. It was the same message. It could be claimed that McGovern was the originator of all of that. What other talents did he have? He was brilliant at art. We haven't touched on his art so far. As a landscape artist, he was quite superb. He produced some excellent works. In 1898, he produced a very decorative version of the Our Father, which drew huge attraction at the time. He also painted Lanterman's Mill, one of the landmarks of your area there in Youngstown. He did 2 or 3 versions of these, highly acclaimed as well. Another thing that he was good at was music. Now, he claimed that he was the only member of his family who wasn't strong in music. We're inclined to think that that was not the case. And the fact that his great-granddaughter, Maureen McGovern, has achieved such fame in this field would suggest that the gene was there from the very beginning. Now, when we were doing our research in America, in addition to the official sources, let us not forget that we had some great foot soldiers on the ground. We cannot forget people like Jennifer Giblin in there from the very beginning. Richard Quinn and his wife Mary, there's no end to the amount of work that they did for us. Bill Lawson and his friends at the Mahoning Valley Historical Society, so supportive of us. Our old friend Todd Franco at the Vindicator, always there to support us as well. And of course, the McGovern clan, because led by Elizabeth McGovern, I think she has been brilliant all along. So too has Mary Lou McGovern Beck, always ready to help us out. Then we have the McGuire branch and their friend Larry Tucker, all coming on board. Without the help of these people, we couldn't have assimilated the amount of information that we have today. Now, there's so much to talk about with regard to McGovern that it's impossible to take it all in. So I might just focus on one year here, 1904. 1904, because at that stage, 2 massive events took place. First of all, there was the AOH convention. The state convention was in Youngstown. McGovern, one of the main organizers of that, one of the main speakers, and as Danny played the tape earlier on, he wrote a special poem for it, Welcome AOH Men. There's another incident that happened in 1904 that I must mention, and it's very important. It was the only visit home that McGovern ever paid. In 1904, he came back to Ireland, and by ship, of course, was the only way at the time. He came towards the autumn of the year. Now, there are many tellings of this story, but it was very important for a number of reasons. First of all, he was able to make contact with his family and friends. Now, his parents were dead, his siblings, he had one brother-in-law alive, but apart from that, now, another reason why this trip was so important, he documented the various changes that he had seen in the 40 years since he left home, and the changes were massive. He mentioned the new churches, the new roads, the new schools, so many changes that he had found. He spoke with some of the local people that we remember from being in positions of authority. The parish priest at the time spoke Irish to them. It was the first chance he had to speak Irish for many, many years. For us, the most important fact about this trip home by McGovern is only for he made this trip home, he will be forgotten forever, because when he came home in 1904, one of the neighbors he visited was Ellen Collins. Ellen Collins was the mother of Kate Collins. Kate Collins, in turn, was the mother of Tommy Scally, and that's how the story carried on. Were it not for that trip home in 1904, McGovern will be forgotten forever. So again, just another element to his life. Now, in addition to his poetry, he was also a great orator. Because, for example, one speech comes to mind. He's a member of so many political organizations. He was a member of the AOH, as we've seen. He was a member of the Finnegan, which followed the Fenian Brotherhood. He was a member of the United Irish League. And when the new organization came up in 1916, he wrote a special poem for that, the Friends of Irish Freedom. He was also heavily involved with the Robert Emmet Literary Society, and he gave one outstanding speech there in 1901. And, you know, he had interesting thoughts on oratory. He wrote, somebody who spends a lot of time writing their thoughts is seldom a good orator. Another element to McGovern was he had a collection of sayings, old philosophical sivings, as I call them, and these are priceless. My favorite one is, the past is regretted, the present is enjoyed, and the future is feared, but lit with the lamp of hope. There's such a wealth of information in there, and such, again, just another aspect to McGovern's life, which was so manifest in many ways. Now, 1913, Jim touched briefly on this. He went for public office. He went with the minority party. He didn't succeed. Did that daunt him? No way. He continued on as active as ever. Another element of McGovern's life that attracts him to us, makes him even more endearing, is there were so many contradictions in his life. Now, we say in his faith, he was a strong traditional Catholic, and yet there were liberal elements. Even the poem I read for you earlier, The Socialist Church, liberal elements to that, so a little contradiction there. Spain, down through the years of history, was a strong ally of Ireland. We're going back to Kinsale and the 9 Years' War. He was highly in praise of that. In the Cuban War in 1898, he turned around and he opposed Spain and took the side of the American. Again, a little contradiction there. He spent most of his life criticizing the heads of the industries, the likes of Carnegie and those, and yet he wrote a warm poem in praise of Carnegie when Carnegie assisted in building a library. Again, a little contradiction, which only endears him to us all the more. He kept saying, don't ever look back. You should look forward, forget about the past. Yet he himself was always looking back to battles of long ago like Clandeboy and Mullaghmast. Another little contradiction there. And even there was an element of pride in McGovern. He once said, I am the only puddler that ever was proud enough to stand at the top of the earth and issue a volume of poems. A little element of pride there, and yet he was a humble man. And when composing his own epitaph, it was so humble. Just place a rock right over me and chisel there so all may know it. Here lie the bones of M. McG, whom people called the Puddler poet. Lovely little contradictions which make him even more endearing to us. Now, from some of his writing, we get the impression that maybe he was a loner, that he stuck to himself. The very opposite was the case. He was so gregarious, and even towards the end of his life, the regular gatherings at his house, all his neighbors and friends came evening after evening. They were known as the Front Porch Club. It was a lovely aspect to his life as well. Now, financially, McGovern made no money. There was no money in poetry. He worked hard at the puddling. He was able to maybe keep bread on the table, but apart from that, nothing else. It was not an easy life. But he got a long, successful, and it's great for us here in Williamstown that he is now not forgotten, that he is remembered. He was remembered in Youngstown. He is now remembered in his home country as well, and he certainly deserves to be remembered.
Well, thank you, Leo and Jim. A question for one or both of you. There was mention of the formal education, if you will, of McGovern, consisting of several months in a hedge school. And many of us listening in today would think of a hedge school as the illegal schools over the centuries where Catholics were forced to resort get an education. But by the time McGovern was in school, this would have been a legal school. Is that right?
In theory, Dan, in theory, it was not illegal anymore because we'll say 1831, the Primary Education Act was passed into law, the Stanley Act of 1831. Now, from then on, it was legal for Catholics to have schools. But as I said, this might have applied in Dublin, in the major centre of the population, but it took a long time to filter down to the rural parts. And in fact, our own Archbishop was opposed to the official primary education system in the beginning for a long time. The first primary school which we got in our own parish was in the same part of the parish as McGovern came from. It was Farm 1870, but it was long after McGovern's time. Now, even though McGovern only had 3 months of formal education, it's obvious that he educated himself to a tremendous extent because he was so widely read in the Greek classics and the English classics, Shakespeare. He was so widely read and he could quote from so many different aspects of literature.
And if we were to come to Ireland today, what would we find as far as the house in which he was raised and maybe the location where he went to the hedge school?
Dan, perhaps I can answer that by saying, look over my shoulder. What you will see is the ruins of the pre-famine cottage, which the McGovern family grew up in. And that's a tiny bit over my right shoulder there. It's a single-story building, to which much later was added a 2-story slated building. And both of them are now derelict and unoccupied. So his birthplace is there. The ruins of the old house, the original old house, are there. It's a gaunt gable end, gaping windows, trees just growing all around it. But most interesting, really, I suppose, almost in a romantic sense, is the fact that the old fireplace, 3 great dolmen-like stones which formed the fireplace, is still there with little nooks and niches and crannies around it, around which the McGovern family would have gathered. And McGovern describes this and makes reference to it when he says that when he was growing up, there was no education, he says quite clearly. There were no books, there were very few newspapers, and the storyteller was the great man in the locality. The storyteller would come in at nighttime and he would recount and recall the great epic stories of Irish history, and that they were the vehicle through which young boys like himself learned their Irish history. And Leo just mentioned, he just dropped in 2 names there, Mast and Candy Boy. Now, they wouldn't mean anything to anybody in Ireland, let alone in the United States. Maybe Irish Americans will remember significant battles like the Boyne and Kinsale and Aughrim, but back in the time of the O'Neills and the O'Donnells, there were 2 really nasty, treacherous betrayals of Irish chieftains at Clandy Boy, which is near Belfast, and at Mast, which is down around County Laois. And this was in Elizabethan times, the time of Elizabeth and her deputy in Ireland, Essex. And there were peace talks going on because there was always a possibility that England would do some kind of deal. It's like history repeating itself over and over and over again with the northern chieftains, O'Neill and O'Donnell, or at least try to stop the wars which are raging year after year after year. So the O'Neills organised a feast at Clandy Boy for Essex and his troops, and thought they would come and talk on Christmas Eve and do a very, very early version of a Belfast peace talks. But unfortunately, they were betrayed, and they had no sooner sat down to the feast than they were all slaughtered. And the exact same thing happened in reverse. Down in Clandy Boy, where again all the O'Carroll and the Midland chieftains were invited. They invited rather the English troops and the English military commanders to a feast, and again they were all slaughtered. So McGovern refers to these in several of his poems an extraordinarily sort of powerful way, where he says, if you have the time just to read this, he wrote these in 1921 when De Valera and Collins and others were negotiating the first of the truce talks. And he was very skeptical. He was completely against Home Rule. He was an unrequited 32-county nationalist who never, I think, changed his opinion on that. And he was warning them that down through history, Irish chieftains were led into peace talks and they were invariably duped. And he said on this occasion, and it's a very historic moment in Irish, Anglo-Irish relations, when in Downing Street, in July 14, I think it was, the peace talks were taking place in Downing Street, and Irish people gathered outside, with men and women. They knelt on the street outside Downing Street, and there's a very powerful picture of this, carrying tricolours and saying the rosary. And while the talks continued, they came each day and prayed the rosary. But McGovern heard of this in Williamstown, and he wrote the following lines. He said, Remember are the parleys of the past when England's satraps plotted to destroy the Irish princely guests at Mullaghmast and the friendly feast at Clonaghoy, where with confiding chieftains peace should be arranged, but by foul conceited plan, the Irish not expecting treachery were off their guard, slaughtered to a man. And he again appeals to them not to place their trust in prayer. And he says, pray on, friends, but don't forget that dollars sent to purchase guns have more effect than prayers, you bet, in aiding Ireland's fighting sons. To Collins and Mulcahy's blows delivered by their gallant foes, and not to prayers, Ireland owes the prospect that her rights will win. And he says that the money sent from the AOH in America at the time was more likely to bring about a 32-county republic than the prayers and the talks which were taking place in Downing Street. And just look at how history bore out the foreboding that Michael McGovern had. And as you know, the AOH in Youngstown contributed $500 to a fund which was being raised at the time to send guns to Ireland. And there are, I think you may or may not have a picture of that particular newspaper article. So that was McGovern. But again, why should we commemorate him? I mentioned briefly before that he does have a relevance that resonates down through the centuries. And on a previous occasion when we were speaking on a Zoom call to some McGovern relations, it's funny, they actually zeroed in on this little 4 or 5 lines of verse when we were asking them how they thought McGovern could in any way, in God's name, this dead poet, how could he be relevant to the world we live in today or the politics we're engaged in? And I think it was Kevin McGuire who said, well, just listen to this little poem. And of course, we were familiar with it, but we were tickled pink that he was aware of this poem, a McGovern descendant, and that it resonated with him. And it was called The Puddler's View of Present Systems, which you may or may not be familiar with. And he says, the plutocrats, the gold bugs, and the tariff lords who rule us all, the press and politicians that will tell us lies to fool us all, the ministers and bishops who ever preach on Christ and pray for us all, the warriors who kill the foes that would invade and slay us all, would one and all be starving did the working man not toil for all. And I think it's a gloriously resonating piece of verse. Is it poetry? Perhaps. Is it verse? It certainly is. Is it a song poem that could be sung to a particular air? It certainly is. Can I just, depending on how time is pressing in on us, say that just picking up on one other thing that Leo said, and McGovern, while he was pessimistic about many things in life, there was an overriding optimism about him in what he wrote. And the older he got, I think, the more he encouraged young people to look forward, to take responsibility for their lives in their own hands, not to be tied by the chains of history, even though he himself, I have to say, in much of what he wrote, did appear to be handcuffed to history. But as he got older, he developed more and more progressive ideas. And in a poem which he wrote in 1908, he'd still been relatively young at the time, called "We Can't Go Back," he said, "The future way is fenced with hope, and knowing what the past has done, let thought pursue its noblest scope, and on the way of progress run. The past is dead, the present lives, and time will bless the age that gives the future greater cause to smile." Not sure if we've lost each other.
If there's time for maybe just a few more small but relevant points. When the American-Spanish War was taking place over Cuba, our friend Michael McGovern may not be aware that his cousin Tom Flynn was actually fighting in the American army at the same time. Another point that comes to mind is Michael never lost his love for his home country. And in fact, around 1905, 1906, some cards appeared which seemed to lampoon the Irish characters. Gave exception to this. And in 1910, he responded most vehemently to this, saying that he could not accept that. On the same theme, Queen Victoria, I think it was 1900, advised the soldiers in the army to wear the shamrock. He took grave exception to that as well. And the last thing I want to say now is he was very much a poet of the people in the sense that he wrote poems to reflect the events of the day. The fire tragedy of 1908, he wrote a beautiful poem in response to the two firemen who lost their lives. Even the scientific developments of the day, the Wright brothers and their aeroplanes, he followed that and wrote poems about them. The race to the North Pole and to the South Pole, again, he followed those. He was a song poet, he was a poet of the people. He wrote about the events of the day. There's so much to say about McGovern. We've only covered a fraction of it today, but that's the man that we're glad is now being remembered.
Leo, what I'd like to do, if we could, is if we would go through the pictures. I'm going to share them up now. And then anybody who's on the Zoom that would like to ask a question or make a comment, I know we have a lot of the folks that have helped you out on. So simply raise your hand and we'll elevate you in. We've hit our hour mark, but traditionally we go about another 30 minutes for questions and answers. So we'll do that. But I'm going to share up these pictures. And if you would simply go through, I think that's the first one you should be able to see of your book. And we'll take it from there if you'll go through these pictures, Leo.
That's the book that we produced in 2013. Is proving to be a most valuable resource, and we're still selling it 7 years, 8 years down the road, because as I said, every house, even the ones that have disappeared, every family is covered back through the generations, and it's just proving to be such an invaluable resource.
Can you see that slide?
Now, again, this is the plaque that I mentioned, and this is where the whole thing started, where Jim spotted this plaque to Tommy Scally, a much-loved local poet, and one of his verses is on the plaque there. Once Jim saw that, it reminded him of the old tape, and from there, the whole voyage of discovery began. This is obviously his hometown land of Castlefield. It's in our parish. It's a small parish with 50 townlands, Castlefield. Now, again, as I said, it was a very busy, heavily populated place. Today, it's quite small, as with most townlands in our parish. But that is the hometown land of the Puddler poet, Michael McGovern. There is the house in which he was born. Now you notice the arrow pointing to the lower section. The lower section, which is two-room cottage, that's where the McGovern family lived. The two-story part was added much later, but it's good that this part still remains. Now, obviously, it's in private ownership at the moment, but it is still standing, a relic to McGovern's past. the fireplace, and this is very special because around this fireplace, McGovern and his parents and his siblings would have heard the fairy stories, the stories of the leprechauns, the pook and the banshees, because the only entertainment of the time was around the fireside, listening to the neighbors telling their stories. And again, if this fireplace could talk, what stories couldn't it tell?
Little lag on the photos, I apologize.
Now, this is the site of the H School. Buchla, it's in the neighbouring parish of Ballymoe. Leary's land was where it was. This is the site where it was. Again, Mr. Cassidy was a school teacher, and even though it was the only 3 months formal education that McGovern ever made, it heightened his interest in education, and he educated himself from there on for the rest of his life. Here is a wedding picture of Michael and Anne Murphy. Now, we're not sure if it was taken at the time of the wedding or taken later in America, because we couldn't actually nail it down, but it is a lovely picture. And again, I suppose the position of the pair indicates the thinking of the time. This is a letter that McGovern wrote when he was 80 years of age, outlining his events for his stay in England, his involvement with the IRB, his acquaintance with Michael Davitt, the fact that he was the one that organised the hall for the reading of poetry by Jane O'Donovan Rossa. This is his only book, Labour Lyrics and Other Poems, published in 1899, a huge success, 25,000 copies, but again, it wouldn't have brought in much in the line of money. Now, our good friend Bill Lawson was kind enough from the Mahoning Valley Historical Society to send us 2 copies, which he discovered in the recent trove. Jim got them rebound, and in fact, they just look just beautiful. These are 2 of the original copies of Labour Lyrics. Thanks to our friends Maguires and Larry Tucker, they came to light in this way. Now, this is, if you like, a typical cartoon picture of Michael McGovern. This was the 1909 AOH picnic, and again, he's regarded as the bard. He himself says he wasn't musical. We're inclined to think that he was, but he was a celebrity, as is clear from the picture. One of his beautiful art pieces, The Our Father, which when it was produced in 1898, was quite a sensation because there's so much detail in it and it's so beautifully finished. Lanterman's Mill. Again, this is a landmark in the Youngstown area, which you good people would know so well. And again, he did this maybe 2 or 3 times. And this one we think is in the possession of Michael Walsh, another of the McGovern clan. And again, beautifully finished. This is the ship on which he made his only trip home in 1904, the SS Celtic. And as I said before, this trip home was so important for so many reasons. Were it not for this trip home, McGovern would never be mentioned at home. And finally, his tomb in Calvary Cemetery in Youngstown. There he is as an older man. The tomb wasn't put up for about 4 years after his death because his friends in various states gathered enough money to put it up, and his own written epitaph is there at the bottom. 1933, and his wife lived for 2 more years after that. Thank you, Danny.
Those were some great pictures. I'd like to recognize Neil Cosgrove next. Neil is really our Irish American Heritage Chair, and since I've been involved, Neil has pushed this, and it's come to the point that we're live with you folks. So thank you, Neil, for your work. Any comments there, Neil? And then we'll go back to Dan and then to Martin Galvin.
Well, first off, thank you to Leo and Jim, not only for today's talk, but ensuring that this great man was rescued from obscurity by your efforts. I mean, you're to be commended, and I thank you. One question that did occur to me was when you were talking about McGovern having been apprenticed as a cobbler. Of course, it brought back thoughts of another great Irish patriot and labor leader who was actually a failed cobbler in Edinburgh, James Connolly. And I'm just curious, being that Connolly was out in the States, primarily in the New York and New Jersey area, but certainly have seemed to have shared a lot of McGovern's views on the plight of labor, if the 2 of them ever crossed paths.
Well, I'm sorry, Leo.
You take that, Jim.
No, I think we were in harmony there. You were about to say, and I was about to say, we simply don't know. The great difficulty with trying to compile a biography on Michael McGovern is that there is just so little material available. He himself doesn't appear to have left any diaries or journals other than a small treasure trove of his work, which has been donated quite recently by his descendants to the Mahoning Valley Historical Society and to Bill Lawson. And it's now being conserved. And we are on tenterhooks, really, to figure out what might be in that collection, because when he died in 1933, there were many newspaper reports which described in very great detail how Michael McGovern wrote and where he wrote and his writing room, really, where his great big desk was. And he had archived the newspaper reports that everything he had ever written, including cuttings from the newspapers which had published his poems, the original manuscripts, his own books of jottings and thoughts, which, must be of immense value if they have survived. All we know is that a section of them, or perhaps a large part of them, we just don't know what amount of this original archive which existed in the McGovern home at Grace Street in 1933 survived, or whether it was divided up amongst members of his family. But if that could be found, it would throw light on all of these questions that we are asking. Did he ever meet Connolly? Who the other influences in his life were? Did he, for instance, meet De Valera in 1919 when he was there? And McGovern wrote this really powerful poem of welcome to De Valera. So the short answer is we don't know. There is so much of an enigma about his time in the IRB, and of course the difficulty there being, as everybody will know, records were rarely, if ever, kept, and we have trawled all known sources in the United Kingdom, police records, that kind of thing, to see if we can find a little bit more about his time in the IRB, and unfortunately we haven't been successful.
And
Martin Galvin had a follow-up to that. Go ahead, Martin. Martin, I think you're muted.
If you're waiting to unmute, Martin, can I just mention one other thing in relation to that last query?
Sorry?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
We can hear you, Martin.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. My question is very much like Neil's. You probably have the same answer. I was just curious about somebody, it's actually buried just a few streets away from me, another Galway man, that's Colonel Thomas Kelly, who was, of course, the American Civil War hero, Fenian, one of the two men rescued by the Manchester Martyrs, would have also had an Ohio connection. I believe he's fought with an Ohio Civil War regiment. And I was just curious, because Michael McGovern went to England, was in the IRB, would have been in contact with Du Bois. With any of that, would he have interacted at all? Is there any way of knowing whether he had interacted with Colonel Thomas Kelly?
And if I can address that question, Martin, the answer is roughly the same. No, we don't know. But Colonel Thomas Kelly is a hugely important figure in this period. And he happens to have been born in a village called Mount Bellew, which is just no more than 10 or 12 miles away from the McGovern home. And I have been asking myself that question. Could he possibly have had some contact with Kelly, or could he, or was he influenced, or was he aware of his movements or his writing? And again, we don't know. I would dearly love to, and we're pursuing it. I can assure you, we're not just leaving it rest. We are trying very hard to see if there was that connection, because he went to Sheffield, after that raid on Chester, that unsuccessful raid where they were trying to take over the barracks and liberate 400,000, I think, rounds of ammunition and about 5 or 10,000 guns, which unfortunately failed again because of infiltration and betrayal. And Thomas Kelly, Colonel Kelly, was of course deeply involved in the period of the Manchester Martyrs. But these connections float around there, and they just invite exploration, and we're working on it, but we don't have an answer. But it is an interesting coincidence, and I do have a hunch, but there's no basis for saying it, that people like that must have been in touch with each other, been aware of each other, influenced each other through the storytellers who would have rambled from villages like Montbellew and Williamstown and Glenamaddie all around that territory at that time, bringing news and stories of what was being planned. But when McGovern came back to Ireland in 1904, Leo mentioned he wrote a really extensive and very important article in a sociological sense. He was shocked to find that the people he met all around Williamstown, his home place, were in no way interested in a rising at the time. And he goes into great detail how he met them in pubs at nighttime and discussed the situation with them. And they were obsessed with retaining or regaining possession of the land. The land was everything. The small farmers, the main thing they wanted to do was drive out the landlords, reclaim the land, and they left the revolutionary idea and the bigger picture to the poets in Dublin. So he was disappointed. He also floated his ideas on socialism past the people of Williamstown in 1904. And they went down like a lead balloon, I have to tell you. And he said of his conversations with them, he kind of despaired, really, that he expected there to be more fire in their bellies and they would be more prepared for a revolution. But that's how he found them.
Jim, as you know, I'm at Youngstown State University, and one of my neighbors is on from Bill Lawson, who's been very helpful for you. I wanted to invite Bill for a couple comments, and Jen Giblin is on. And so we'll kind of tighten up the answers and take a few comments, and Tim Noonan will say a few words and we'll close. And I also want to recognize Marilyn Madigan, our from Our Lady's vice president. She was a former historian, and I was trying to coax her to get on because I think she may have been at that convention in Youngstown in 1904, but since she won't come on, I'm going to leave it at that. Bill Lawson.
Well, thank you, Danny. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. First, I just want to say hello to Jim, Leo, and Eileen in the background. We've been corresponding via email for more than a year, but to see your faces and hear your voices is a delight, as was the stories that you told today. So I really appreciated being involved in this webinar. And I just want to do a little bit of follow-up. I think Jim mentioned that the McGuire line of the family donated to our historical society, Mahoning Valley Historical Society, 2 handwritten, bound manuscripts of poetry from Michael McGovern's later life. One is complete with a cover page. It was dated 1931. The other one seems to be missing at least a couple of pages, but the paper is very fragile, and we did not want to leaf through until we did something to stabilize it. So the documents are now at a conservator in Cleveland, looking to separate the bindings, put the individual pages into protective covers, and then we can move forward toward just finding out what all is there, what has been published, what was never published, and working on a body of scholarship here in the States, while over in Galway, they're working to finish their biography, which I've read a lot of the details to it. It's tremendous. So thank you for having me here.
Lovely to see you, Bill. And again, thanks for your ongoing support, which is great.
Thank you, Bill. We certainly are looking forward to when Leo and Jim come over to Youngstown, hopefully sooner than later. Jen,
Yes.
if you unmute, and we welcome you to say a few words. There you go.
Hi. This was great. I met Eileen when she messaged me because through Ancestry, because one of my cousins actually married Michael McGovern's son. So that's how we found each other and just went from there.
Well, clearly they appreciated your support, and we thank you for being on.
Thanks a million.
Thank you.
Tim Noonan, if you have some comments and questions from our folks on YouTube.
I do. One of the questions is those photographs that were shown on the presentation. Are those available in a book, or is the book that was shown is that available for sale still?
The book is available. Now, the book doesn't contain the photographs. It contains details on the families and on the landmarks and everything you want to know about the parish. And it's still available and it's still selling all over the world.
Excellent, excellent. Another question. Through the labor poems, in that there was, at around the same time, the Haymarket riots were going on in Chicago. Is there any reference, or is there any, can you speak on behalf of what was going on in the general labor movement through the United States as it relates to Michael McGovern?
McGovern's line was always consistent. He never deviated from it one iota. He was always against the plutocrats, as he called them. He was on the side of the worker. He never deviated one time. He didn't, as far as we know, link directly to the Chicago situation at any one time, but his line was firm all through.
Very good. And he was pretty much self-educated, as you described. And through his poetry, did he have certain influencers, the poets that he looked up to, that he kind of maybe modeled his style?
We have no idea. We have no idea. We have no idea. He's curious in an Irish sense, in that there have only ever been two Labour poets in Ireland that have achieved any significance. Ireland has produced thousands of lyrical poets, of narrative poets, but McGovern and another man called Jim Connell, who wrote a very famous poem and song called The Red Flag, was born in County Meath. And they were more or less contemporary. Jim Connell lived in England most of his life, and he was a working man. And McGovern was the poet of the American labor movement at the same time.
Very good, very good. And now, finally, the house still exists in Ireland. Is the house that he lived in Youngstown, is that still up and able to visit, or is it a museum? Or
well, Richard Quinn could tell you all about that. If I could say, the answer is absolutely no. Richard Quinn has done an immense amount of work in tracking every house that Michael McGovern lived in Youngstown, and he has created what I call a Michael McGovern heritage trail that I hope somebody in Youngstown might eventually mark with some plaques. But no, his house, as I understand it, and Richard is probably listening to me in the background there, was demolished to make way for the expressway. And all of the other houses have been pulled down, and Richard has gone to each of these locations. He's tracked them on maps, cross-referenced them with city directories and indexes. He's taken photographs of the current state of all of the locations that the McGovern houses once stood in. And that in itself is a fabulous piece of work that could easily become a very interesting book that will certainly be part of the work we're doing, but it could stand separately as part of a heritage tourist trail within Youngstown. And Richard, God bless him, has already done all of the groundwork for that.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. That's questions I have from YouTube. If I'm going to pass it over to you, Danny.
Okay, and folks, we want to just thank everyone for joining us today. We had well over 150 people in and out throughout the day, probably close to 200. I won't know the exact numbers until we look at them afterwards. I'd like to remind everybody that every Saturday at 1 o'clock in March, we will have an Irish American Heritage Month event. Next week, we will be doing the Irish in the American Civil War, and our next week, I should say. And then our last event is hopefully going to be the Irish in dealing with Abraham Lincoln. And then next Sunday, we'll have a special event that's not directly tied to Irish American Heritage Month, but it's on the Moore Street, the birthplace of the Republic. So we'll see how that goes. I'd like to turn it back to Dan Taylor to close this out. On behalf of the AOH and LAOH, I obviously want to thank Jim, Leo, and Eileen for their time. Rich Quinn's here with me. Come on up here, Rich. And Youngstown, come on up here and join us here. And his wife, Mary, if you two come up here. The two of them, when I went to Ireland, I visited both Jim on one occasion and Leo on the other, and Eileen, and both great hosts, all three of them. All they could talk about was Mary Quinn and her husband, Rich. So Rich and Mary, if you want to say hello to everybody, and Dan, if any closing comments from Leo and Jim, and then Dan, you wrap it up. Leo?
I'd just like to say maybe two things. First of all, from hearing about St. Columba's Church and the Monkey's Nest and the Mahoning River and the Lanterman's Bell, we feel that we know Youngstown as well as you do yourselves. The last thing I want to say is, when McGovern died, the tributes were so warm in the local newspapers. They were just beautiful. And one line stays with me in particular. It was one of your predecessors, Todd, the editor of The Vindicator, and he said this beautiful line: McGovern exemplifies the inexhaustible richness of the Irish nature. I think that says it all. And seeing that next Wednesday is St. Patrick's Day, could I say in Irish, Ballathy na féile Poetic oribh Galéir.
Thank you, Leo. And Todd was on today. We want to thank him for being on. He did have to leave before we had a chance to get him on. Jim, closing comments?
Danny, I want to congratulate you on organizing the entire series of webinars because the importance of marking and commemorating Irish people who have been scattered to the four corners of the earth is of enormous consequence, really. As an amateur historian, it thrills me every time I find somebody else is digging away at the story of an Irish man or an Irish woman who's achieved significant fame in their own areas. And so I just want to say to you, in the work that you are doing, in the contributions that will continue as part of this webinar, that I just want you to continue doing what Emily Lawless said, and that is to take the names of Irish people, some known and some forgotten, and listen to their names echoing down the wind, blown backwards from the lips of fame.
Thank you. And before we go to Dan for the close, I'd like to remind everybody this webinar will be on YouTube. If you simply go to YouTube and type in Ancient Order Hibernians, you'll find today's webinar. The number one thing you can do to help us is share that webinar and also join the AOH page. Dan Taylor, our national historian.
Thank you, Danny. This time of year, as St. Patrick's Day approaches, we are usually subjected as part of the commercialization of St. Patrick's Day just to t-shirts and memes that are ridiculing or lampooning, stereotyping the Irish race. And back in McGovern's time, it was penny postcards. And I think Leo or Jim mentioned that McGovern took a position on this and wrote a letter to the Vindicator decrying these penny postcards that lampooned and burlesqued, as he said, the Irish people. Our purpose in this series has been to provide substantive educational quality programming about the heritage of Irish Americans. And I think today's presentation by Leo and Jim has been exactly what we were looking for, a marvelous contribution to Irish Heritage Month. So thank you to Jim and Leo and to everyone who participated today.
Thank you very much. And again, everyone, we appreciate you joining today. And we look forward to seeing you all next week.
There on lines sky. No pipe did hum, no battle drum did sound its loud tattoo, but the Angelus bells or the Levy swells rang out in the foggy dew. Right proudly high in Dublin town hung there the flag of war. For 'twas better to die 'neath an Irish sky than at Suvla or Sudelbar. And from the plains of royal Meath, strong men came hurrying through, while Britannia's Huns with their long-range guns sailed in through the foggy dew. Our bravest fell, and the Requiem bell rang mournfully and clear. For those who died at Eastertide in the springing of the year. How the world did gaze with deep amaze at those fearless men, but few, who bore the fight that freedom's light might shine through the foggy dew. And back through the glen I rode again, and my heart with grief was sore. For I parted then with valiant men, whom I never shall see more. But to and fro in my dreams I go, and I kneel and pray for you. For slavery fled, all glorious dead, when you fell in the foggy dew.
Thank you all.